19. أنا بتمنى كمان اللي إلهم يعني سنين بالسجن، الأحكام العالية، النساء، الأطفال، إن شاء الله الكل بيطلع.
Talking about another military development in the West Asian region, with the development in technology and warheads, hypersonic missiles are being introduced into the arsenal of great powers that can fundamentally alter strategic stability in the region. In the latest, in the presence of Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, Iran unveiled its new hypersonic missile, the Fateh 2. It can evade even the most advanced anti-ballistic missile systems of the US and Israel. Tehran claims that the weapon is a new version of its first domestically made hypersonic ballistic missile that it unveiled back in June. Fateh, the word means conqueror in Farsi. According to reports, Fateh 2 is equipped with a hypersonic glide vehicle warhead that can maneuver and glide at hypersonic speeds. It can change its trajectory after being fired, and that is what makes it so difficult to be intercepted. And constantly it can alter its trajectory, making interception extremely complicated, apart from making it difficult. The precision-guided two-stage missile can hit targets within a range of 1,400 kilometers with a velocity of between Mach 13 and 20. This means it can travel up to 5 times the speed of sound towards its target. Basically, the Fateh 2 warhead can reach speeds of up to 24,000 kilometers per hour, to give you better context of the speed that it can get to.
Now, despite a breakthrough in hostage release negotiations, there are still fears that the ongoing Israel-Hamas war might become a larger maritime war in the region. Shivan gets us all the details. Over to you, Shivan.
Thanks, Him. Of course, there's one good news, but then there are still a lot of fears about the war spreading into the larger West Asian region, which it already is. But now there is a new front coming up. The Israel-Hamas war has caused violence across different regions in West Asia, but now there are fears of it escalating into a maritime war. This comes as Yemen's rebel group, the Houthis, have claimed to seize a cargo ship in the southern Red Sea, further escalating tensions in the region. Today, we will decode if the heightened regional tensions are playing out on a new maritime front. First, let me show you a video. The video you see on the wall here, Yemen's Huthi rebels have released a footage of the hijacked ship. Take a look at this. It starts right here with the camera fitted right behind the helicopter. They come down. These are armed men. They are, of course, they are very well armed with bulletproof vests. They are trained and they are entering and infiltrating into the ship. The helicopter takes off and they continue further. Now, this is footage which has been released from the Yemeni Houthi rebel group. The Houthis hijacked this cargo ship. The name of the ship is Galaxy Leader, and it was in the Red Sea. Now, the ship was traveling from Turkey to India, and now it has taken to Yemen, taking 25 of its crew members on board as hostage. So, you see, the Red Sea shipping route is one of the busiest in the world. There are thousands of ships transiting through this stretch of water daily. Now, I'd also like to give you a glimpse of a map which will give you an idea of the kind of maritime traffic that we're talking about here. The Red Sea is a vital economic artery and is likely to become more so in the coming decades as a result of the large oil reserves throughout the region and precious metal resources here as well. Now, this is the strip of land, and essentially this is where there is a lot of maritime traffic. Now, this makes the route critical for the global energy security. More than 10% of global trade passes through the Red Sea each year. Most ships sailing from Europe to Asia take this route as it is a cost-effective route as well, and you can make out why. It crosses 2 of the 10 most strategic waterways in the world: the Bab al-Mandab at the sea's southern entrance and Egypt's Suez Canal right up top in the north. But there are security issues in the region as well. The drivers of insecurity in this area of the world center on proxy activities and regional rivalries. Historically speaking, Piracy off the coast of Somalia was formerly the #1 security issue in the area of the Red Sea. But it has been reduced significantly now to a non-factor by a massive international naval operation that began in 2008. Now, since then, the war in Yemen has taken the place of piracy as the leading source of instability in the region. So what began as a political uprising and civil war in Yemen soon became another theater in the Saudi-Iranian contest for regional supremacy when Iran supported Yemen's Houthi rebels. Now, viewers, when Yemen's Houthi rebels released the footage that we showed you earlier of the hijacked ship in one of the busiest maritime trade routes, this is where it took place, questions started to arise. How did the rebel group know which ship to target? There are so many ships going over there. How did the Houthis manage to find a ship with an Israeli connection amongst the hundreds and thousands of other ships? Did any country provide the fighters with the intelligence that they needed to make it such a pinpointed strike? And they were armed with all their gear, and of course they had everything filmed as well. They knew what they're going to do with the footage. They were going to send out a message to the rest of the world. Was it Iran who gave the Yemeni Houthis the required intelligence? Iran is accused of backing the Houthis, though Tehran has denied helping the Houthis in this hijacking operation. But according to reports, the fighters used a helicopter, war commando style bulletproof vests, as we showed you, and they brandished assault rifles. Private intelligence firms are calling the hijacking an Iranian style vessel capture, and some are even pointing at how the attack is reminiscent of the vessel seizures that Iran's Revolutionary Guard have carried out in the past. Moreover, viewers, what's interesting here is that the hijacked ship passed by one of Iran's cargo vessels just before this attack took place. Now, this Iranian vessel is called Beheshad. The Beheshad is in the Red Sea since 2021 and it is sanctioned by America. US suspects that this cargo ship that I told you about, the Iranian cargo ship, moonlights as a forward spying base. Now, the hijacking of the Galaxy Leader points at a very disturbing sign. It is a sign of how the war in West Asia could play out on a new maritime front. Reuters is reporting that at least 2 commercial vessels linked to the same company have already changed their course in the Red Sea, and it is already creating fear that such incidents of hijacking might become the new normal in this war in West Asia. So, of course, there is a lot that has been happening in this war, with the maritime front becoming the next front where this war can spill over. But there is a glimmer of hope as well, with the hostage deal nearly through from both sides.
Now, of course, we're starting with the major breakthrough that appears to have come in this conflict that's entered its 7th week. Now, it is achieved in this ongoing Israel-Hamas war. That is a deal on hostage release.
It's a huge breakthrough, one which everyone has been waiting to hear of since the war started. Now, in the latest, Israel has approved an agreement to secure the release of hostages being held by Hamas. All details of the agreement have not been made public yet, but as per an Israeli government official briefing, deal is expected to see the release of 50 living Israeli citizens, mostly women and children, in groups of 12 to 13 people per day for 4 days in total.
Now, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has said that the deal, it's the right decision as he summoned his war cabinet. However, he did add that the war will continue.
יש בחוץ דיבורי הבל, כאילו אחרי ההפוגה להשבת חטופינו, אנחנו נפסיק את המלחמה. אז אני מבקש להבהיר, אנחנו במלחמה, ונמשיך במלחמה. נמשיך במלחמה עד שנשיג את כל היעדים שלנו.
Hamas senior officials had said the talks are at a decisive moment. US President Joe Biden also said they are very close to the deal. However, nothing is done until done.
While the deal is secured, relatives of Hamas-held hostages demonstrate outside Israeli Defense Ministry. Families, they're longing for the return of their loved ones. They protested in high anticipation of the deal, while some of them kept their hopes low and wished not to rely much on it.
Despite the negotiations, there has been little respite in fighting on ground though. Israeli army continues to release footage of operations in Gaza.
The Israeli military said that it had pushed further into a tunnel underneath the Al-Shifa hospital complex. It released an image of what it says is a blast door that was breached. The army also released a picture of the tunnel passage beyond the breached doorway. Elsewhere, the IDF has completed its encirclement of Jabalia, which is north of Gaza City. The army describes this as a significant combat area.
On the other hand, the military wing of Hamas released a video that shows militants planting explosives to target Israeli soldiers.
Now on Tuesday, BRICS nations convened an extraordinary summit to discuss the crisis in Gaza. The meet was virtually hosted by South Africa. The nations called for an immediate and sustained humanitarian truce in Gaza.
South Africa's parliament also voted in favor of a motion calling for the closure of Israel's embassy in Pretoria, as well as the suspension of diplomatic ties with the country. Now, it is up to President Cyril Ramaphosa's government to implement the decision. While chairing the BRICS meet, Ramaphosa accused Israel of war crimes and genocide.
The collective punishment of Palestinian civilians through the unlawful use of force by Israel is a war crime. The deliberate denial of medicine, fuel, food and water to the residents of Gaza is tantamount to genocide.
Now, Israel's government has voted to back a deal for Palestinian Hamas militants to free 50 women and children held as hostages in Gaza.
And according to the Israeli Prime Minister's office, hostages will be released over 4 days, during which there will be a lull in the fighting. And the announcements are the most optimistic yet of a potential breakthrough in this conflict, which has raged on for almost 7 weeks. It's left thousands dead on both sides.
Now, Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu told a meeting of his cabinet that accepting a deal for the release of hostages was a difficult decision, but it's the right decision. He stated that Israel will continue its war against Hamas even if a temporary ceasefire is reached with the militant group. Netanyahu also thanked the US President Joe Biden for his part in the deal to include more hostages and fewer crises.
דיבורי הבל, כאילו אחרי ההפוגה להשבת חטופינו, אנחנו נפסיק את המלחמה. אז אני מבקש להבהיר, אנחנו במלחמה, ונמשיך במלחמה. נמשיך במלחמה עד שנשיג את כל היעדים שלנו. לחסל את החמאס, להשיב את כל חטופינו ונעדרינו, ולהבטיח שבעזה לא יהיה שום גורם שמאיים על ישראל.
Now, sources from Hamas and Islamic Jihad, which took part in the 7th October attacks, disclosed details to news agency AFP on the condition of anonymity. They said that the tentative agreement would include complete ceasefire on the ground and an end to Israeli operations over Gaza, except in the north, where they would only halt for 6 hours a day. Under the deal, which the sources said could yet change, between 50 and 100 Israeli and dual national civilians will be released in exchange for some 300 Palestinian women and children currently held in Israeli jails. The proposed deal would also allow for up to 300 trucks of food and medical aid to enter Gaza.
ولكن أنا بعتقد أننا في لحظات حاسمة في هذا الأمر، وإحنا كلنا أمل إن شاء الله تعالى إنه تكون هذه الهدنة. إحنا هذه الهدنة المؤقتة التي بموجبها هو وقف العدوان أيام ودخول الإغاثة لشعبنا وتكثيف هذه الإغاثة، وأيضا بموجبها هي تبادل يعني المدنيين، نساء وأطفال مقابل نساء وأطفال من سجون الاحتلال. الخوض في التفاصيل هذا باعتقادي مش مفيد. المهم عندما ينتهي، لأنه نخشى الاحتلال يراوغ له شهر، وكلما اقتربنا من الاتفاق يعود إلى الوراء.
Hopes of a release deal have been mounting since Qatar stated only minor practical issues remain. Ahead of the meetings, Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh had said, and I'm quoting here, "We are close to reaching a deal on a truce."
As stated in Arabic, we cannot comment on the details of the ongoing negotiations. We are working towards an agreement taking place, and we are now at the closest point we ever have been in reaching an agreement. We are very optimistic, we are very hopeful, but we are also very keen for this mediation to succeed in reaching a humanitarian truce.
The BRICS group of nations, including Russia, India and China, called for an immediate, durable and sustained humanitarian truce leading to a cessation of hostilities in Gaza. Here's what the U.S. State Department spokesperson had to say.
We are very close to an agreement, but we are not there yet. As you have heard us say a number of times over the course of the past few weeks, nothing is final until everything is final. And at this point, everything is not yet final, but we are close.
Now, the hostage families have demanded that Israel should insist on the return of all those being held. The religious Zionist party, a part of the coalition government, has voiced opposition to the deal, denouncing it as bad for Israel's security, for the hostages and for the soldiers.
Some security experts have warned that a talked-about 5-day pause in fighting could enable Hamas to regroup, and that Hamas's demand for the Israel Defense Forces not to use observation drones during that time could put Israeli soldiers at risk. The Israeli government is facing a dilemma, with their two top priorities being to secure the release of the hostages while dismantling Hamas. And the government's job will be to balance these two stated goals. This is Jodie Cohen for WION World is One.
We're now joined by Bishop Garrison, a fellow at the National Security Institution at George Mason Law School and adjunct professor at Georgetown University. Sir, thank you so much for joining us on World DNA.
Thank you for having me.
Now, Mr. Garrison, Israel's cabinet, as I mentioned earlier, it's approved the hostage deal for the release of 50 hostages for multi-day ceasefire. This, of course, I don't need to say it, it is a major breakthrough. Talk to us about how you see this altering the course of this ongoing war.
Absolutely. Well, anytime you have hostages released in this type of situation, it's a good thing. Again, as we've stated, as others have already discussed on this point, though, Israel is still finding itself very much in a hot war with Hamas right now, with the terrorist organization. So this is a positive step forward. I applaud the Biden administration for being able to help support these efforts, with Secretary Blinken and the president directly having a hand in this. But it is not over yet. It's not done until it's done, until not only we're able to get these hostages out of harm's way, but to get all the hostages out of harm's way. It was roughly a little over 240 that were taken on October 7th initially, to include Americans and Israelis within those numbers. So this is a very positive step forward, and we'll see some humanitarian aid, somewhere in upwards of 300 trucks per day, moving in food and aid and fuel and supplies into the area, as you said, has been under a great deal of stress since this war began. But again, it is a step forward, not the final step.
It's definitely a step forward, Mr. Garrison. As you said, I want to take it a little further from there. Now, do you feel that the hostage deal and the frequent pauses, if there are more, and here's hoping that there will be more, will they help curb down the overall scale of the war, even though it will continue?
Of course, also important to mention now that the Hamas has welcomed this approval of the hostage release deal. That is the latest that is coming in. So that's another facet of this major breakthrough, that Hamas is now welcoming this deal to release hostages.
Well, yeah, well, it's a very, very valid question. Again, the primary point that we need to make here is to get the hostages out of harm's way. That will entail some amount of a negotiation, and that's what we're seeing exactly here. We're seeing aid come in because you still have other innocent civilians within the area, the vast majority of which, for both the hostages and other innocents caught in this, are all women and children. So we need to do everything we can in order to see these individuals taken out of the situation first and foremost. To the point about the use of drones and the concerns that any pauses may allow Hamas to regroup and to be able to shift their operations once again. That is an inherent risk with a situation like this. But in order to get those individuals safe, you have to have take on some amount of risk in that regard. So we don't know until we see more of this play out. But again, strategists and tacticians on the ground are thinking through these things, and it's a very dynamic situation.
Right, Mr. Garrison, of course, as we speak, there are a lot of developments that are coming in. One, that Hamas has now welcomed this move. Also, from what we do know so far, as per reports are coming in, the first hostage release would be on Thursday. That is, of course, a major development that has come in this regard. Netanyahu, however, earlier had clarified that this does not mean they're stopping the war. They will continue to fight until they achieve their goals. One, I think it's also important to understand and get some clarity on what their broader objectives here are. And would Israel be willing to have longer or more frequent pauses in this war going forward?
Well, that's a very valid question that I believe the United States, both in public and behind closed doors, are continuing to ask of the Israeli government. How many pauses are they willing to take on? How long are those pauses going to be? And what are the intended end state here? And what happens after this war is complete and those objectives or those goals are met? There's still a lot of questions that need to be asked here. But again, we have to continue to see this develop with some level of humanitarian support and aid taking place, because you have so many innocents that are now involved with this, and so many of them are women and children. So as Israel is continuing to think through its next steps, it has to take those ideas into account.
All right. Thank you for joining in, Mr. Bishop Garrison. Pleasure to have you here on World DNA with us.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so let's start this broadcast with the big story that we are tracking on WION at this hour. And this happens to be the first big breakthrough in the war that has broken out between Israel and Gaza that has now dragged on for over 45 more days. Now, Israel's cabinet has approved what is being dubbed as a ceasefire deal with the Hamas group that would bring a temporary halt to the devastating campaign of bombing that has now stretched over 6 long weeks over the Gaza Strip. As part of the deal, Hamas has agreed to free about 50 hostages over a period of 4 days. This is how long this pause is expected to last. Now, the Israeli government has said that it will extend the lull by an additional day for every 10 hostages who would be released. Hamas has welcomed Israel's move and has dubbed it a humanitarian truce. In a statement, it has said that about 150 Palestinian prisoners will also be released from the Israeli prisons as part of this agreement. The report suggests that the first group of hostages could be released by as early as Thursday. Now, the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu has told a meeting of his cabinet that accepting a deal for the release of the hostages was a difficult decision, but it is the right decision for the state of Israel. He has also stated that Israel will continue with its war against Hamas even if a temporary ceasefire is reached with the Hamas group. Netanyahu has also thanked the American President Joe Biden for his part in the deal to include more hostages and fewer prizes. A U.S. official has said that 3 Americans amongst Gaza hostages are set to be released.
There is idle talk outside, as if after the truce to return abductees, we will stop the war. So I would like to make it clear, we are at war, and we will continue the war. We will continue the war until we achieve all our objectives. Eliminate Hamas, return all abductees and missing persons, and ensure that there will be no element in Gaza that threatens Israel.
The sources from within Hamas and Islamic Jihad have reportedly disclosed some interesting details to the news agency AFP. Now, they've said that the tentative agreement will include a complete ceasefire on the ground and also an end to Israeli campaign of bombings, air bombings over the Gaza Strip, except in the north, where they would only halt for 6 hours per day. Now, under the deal, which the sources have said this could of course change, anywhere from 50 to 100 Israeli and dual national civilians could be released in exchange for a greater number of Palestinian prisoners from Israel. The proposed deal would allow for up to 300 trucks of food and medical aid to enter into the Gaza Strip.
I believe we are in the decisive moments, and we are hopeful, God willing, for this temporary pause that would stop aggression for some days, deliver aid and swap civilians, for women and children in the occupation's prisons. We cannot go into details because we are nervous that the occupation will delay, which it has been doing for a month. And the closer we get to a deal, they go back.
Now, the hostages' families have demanded that Israel should in fact insist on the return of all those who are being held. The religious Zionist party, a part of the coalition government, has voiced opposition to this deal securing the release of hostages. It has denounced it as bad for Israel's security and for the hostages and even the soldiers. All right, now to give us more perspective in terms of what this truce, of course, means, we're being joined by retired Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis. He is a military strategist. He's also the host of the Daniel Davis Deep Dive on YouTube. He's joining us live on this broadcast. Now, sir, let me in fact start off by asking you this. The war has gone on for well over 6 weeks now, and there is a breakthrough that has now been achieved. It is a humanitarian pause, that's what it appears to be, for a period of 4 days in exchange for certain hostages who would be released. It is said that anywhere from 40 to 50 hostages are expected to be released by Hamas. What do you read into this humanitarian truce that has been agreed upon by the State of Israel and Hamas?
Yeah, it took quite a bit of wrangling, even within the war cabinet itself, because there's still quite a few people, as you alluded to, who are against this, and they're coming out saying, "Oh, this is a bad thing because it will allow Hamas to strengthen its position. It'll make our job harder. We need to keep the pressure on so that they'll release all the hostages." But look, I'm with Netanyahu on this one. I think he's absolutely right. They need to prioritize getting all those hostages back, and almost no matter what it takes. Because I can just tell you from a military perspective, there's no question that Hamas will take advantage of the opportunity and they will reinforce some of their positions, but it'll be minor. It's going to be inconsequential to how this war goes. It's not going to change the outcome. It might delay it a little bit, but if delaying that means that you get hostages back, that's a great deal. Because I assure you, every family member of every single one of those hostages is extremely anguished over what's been going on, will be so happy if they get back. And if they took the advice of these other folks and continued fighting and they ended up getting hostages killed, then they would be a lot angrier at the Israeli government.
That's absolutely true, because the families of the hostages had been demanding that the Netanyahu government should strike a deal as soon as they can. Now, in the past, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had said that he did not want to strike a deal because that would break the momentum of the war. So, as a military strategist, how do you see this humanitarian pause? Because this is clearly not a ceasefire. A ceasefire would mean something a bit more permanent. What has been agreed upon is a pause for a period of 4 days that can be extended if Hamas continues to release more of the hostages. But what do you think this actually does to the war?
Yeah, and look, it's definitely the right thing. I mean, because the whole war is being fought to protect your people. And so since some of them are hostages, you have to take whatever action is necessary to get your hostages back. On the tactical front, though, look, this could also be a benefit to Israel, because you can have a pause in your own fighting. You can get yourself together. You can, catch your breath a little bit of your troops. And then you can say, all right, now the next phase, let's get this plan really good. Let's get it resourced, and then let's get going better. So, I mean, I've been in some of these situations in combat myself in the Middle East. And these pauses, sometimes even in a fast-paced offensive operation, can be very useful.
Right, now, speaking purely in terms of military terms, Israel has carried on with its campaign for well over 6 weeks. This is the 7th week of Israeli campaign of relentless bombardment on the Gaza Strip, which has sparked off a humanitarian disaster there. But militarily speaking, Israel's objective is the destruction of Hamas. How far do you think Israel has succeeded in limiting Hamas's capabilities?
I'll tell you, this is where I do part ways with some of the statements coming out of Tel Aviv. is that they believe that they can attain peace for their people by militarily destroying Hamas. And I don't see any prospect of that. They can come and literally gut the city of Gaza. They can go down to Khan Yunis and they can, do more. They can kill lots of people, but they are not going to bring peace, because by destroying the infrastructure, killing so many thousands of innocent Palestinian people, all they're going to do is build up more anger for themselves and potentially more enemies. So I think Israel's going to have to look really hard at what it's doing. If the objective is to bring peace, they're going to have to do something different, because just bombs and airplanes is not going to do it.
Absolutely. And over the course of the last fortnight, we've been witnessing what was happening at the Al-Shifa hospital, the biggest medical facility in the northern part of Gaza. Israel had originally claimed that there was a Hamas command center. The Americans had described it slightly differently. They said it was some kind of a Hamas command node, which Hamas had inside the Al-Shifa hospital premises. But now it appears that Israelis are indicating that Hamas's command centers and their leadership is actually in the southern city of Khan Yunis. Khan Yunis should have been a safe zone, because this is where Israel had asked all the Palestinians in Gaza to evacuate to. Do you think the Americans would be willing to back an Israeli offensive into the southern part of Gaza?
Well, I'm afraid we're probably going to find out, because I think the plan has been all along is to first seal off the northern part of Gaza, especially Gaza City, try and do whatever they want to clear this. And then I think the plan has always been to then turn south. It wouldn't make any sense to do otherwise. So they're definitely, the IDF is definitely planning on going south, and they've been setting the stage for that already with the increase in a number of airstrikes. They've been telling some of the people in the southern part to move out of those areas and to move to other areas that are further outside. So they're definitely planning on going on there. Now, whether the United States backs that or not, I think remains to be seen. I don't think it's an automatic yes based on how many civilians have been getting killed. Right. And that area is so much more dense. I don't know what's going to happen there, but it's
but the world's attention at this moment is also on the number of civilians, innocent civilians and children who are getting killed. The death toll in the Palestinian territory of Gaza Strip is now said to be over 13,500. 40% of all those who've been killed, that is more than 5,000 of those who've been killed, are said to be children. So clearly there is an increasing voice that's now demanding that this war needs to stop. But militarily speaking, Lieutenant, how much longer do you think Israel has to carry on with its campaign?
Well, I mean, I think that militarily speaking, if you're just looking at the tactics, I mean, Israel has the capacity to completely take the entire Gaza Strip, all of it. They won't have any problem with capacity. But war is all about the political angle and the will of the people to fight and the will of the other side. And in this case, it's the will of the international community, because Israel needs the Western support every bit as much as they need the military capacity on the ground. Because if they lose that, then everything's going to change. And as you point out, those numbers are already really high, and so many of them are children. A lot of them are infants that had to be moved out because, the hospitals had ceased to function, and that tears at the heartstrings of a lot of people. And I think the patience is running out on that. And if you start moving in south into the Khan Yunis area, then those casualties are going to probably spike even higher, and that's where you're going to have some real problems maintaining support.
Absolutely. Thank you very much indeed, Colonel Daniel Davis, for joining us and getting us those details there.
Always my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
More than 13,300 Gazans have lost their lives in the Israel-Hamas war to date, while hundreds more continue to perish daily. The toll of healthcare workers following Israel's onslaught also paints a grim picture. According to the Palestinian Health Ministry, the number of healthcare workers killed in the Gaza Strip since the 7th of October, it's reached 220. This as Israel continues to relentlessly bombard and invade Gaza hospitals. The death toll of aid workers is also mounting by the day, and according to the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees, at least 104 of its staff members have also been killed in the Gaza enclave since the conflict broke out. The case for reporters and journalists is no different. In the latest, Bilal Jadala, one of the most respected journalists in Gaza, was killed in the relentless Israeli onslaught on the Gaza Strip. Israeli bombardment of South Lebanon earlier killed 4 civilians. 2 of them were journalists of Lebanon's Al Mayadeen television. Al Mayadeen said its correspondent Farah Omar and cameraman Rabi Mamari were killed. The Israeli military said it was looking into the details of the incident. Al Mayadeen director said that the 3rd civilian killed with the 2 journalists was also a contributor to the channel. Known as the godfather of Palestinian journalism, Jadala was the chairman of the Gaza Press House, established in 2014. The organization is dedicated to training the region's future journalists. Jadala's death brings the number of journalists killed since the start of the Israeli campaign on the 7th of October to 53. These include 46 Palestinians, 4 Israelis, 1 Lebanese journalist. Take a look at this video that was released by the Palestinian journalist Hassouna Salim, outlining the many dangers being faced by Palestinian journalists on the ground. Salim was killed in an Israeli airstrike on the 19th of November.
مخيم نبريج المخيم الذي يكتظ بالسكان وسط المخيم. نتحدث عن استهداف الاحتلال لحي سكني كامل يتكون من عشرات المنازل. نتحدث عن عشرات الشهداء، عن عشرات المفقودين تحت الأنقاض. نتحدث عن عشرات المصابين في أزقة الشوارع والبيوت المجاورة. نتحدث الآن عن قيام المواطنين بإخراج بعض الأشخاص.
And then there are the thousands of civilian casualties, which are still increasing by the hundreds daily. According to the Palestinian Health Ministry, more than 5,500 children have lost their lives in the Gaza enclave since the conflict broke out on the 7th of October. 3,250 women have also been killed in Gaza. The Palestinian Health Ministry in the West Bank has said not only this, 695 elderly people too have reportedly been killed in Gaza. Now, our correspondent Susan Tehrani elucidates us on what the spokesperson John Kirby has stated on the immediate future of the crisis in Gaza. Let's listen in.
John Kirby said that the United States does not support Israeli operations expanding to other territories in the Gaza Strip unless the Israelis have a plan to protect those civilians who have fled to the southern part of that region. Kirby, speaking to reporters on a call, said that as the IDF is considering expanding its operations to the south of Gaza, the U.S. has made clear to their Israeli counterparts that it does not support this kind of operation to, quote, protect what is mathematically a dramatic increased civilian population in the south.
All right, for more on this, we have with us Dr. Avner Cohen, who is a professor of non-proliferation and terrorism studies at the Middlebury Institute. Welcome to Newspoint, Doctor.
Good morning.
Now, Doctor, the hostage deal, it's definitely a breakthrough. It is something that everyone had been hoping to see and see it get facilitated at the earliest. I wanted to ask you, this is a major breakthrough. Talk to us about how this can alter the course of the war going forward, because as Benjamin Netanyahu made it clear that the war has not stopped, it's a temporary pause. How will it affect the ongoing war?
Well, it's an open question. The very idea that there is a ceasefire for at least 4 days, with the possibility that the ceasefire could be extended. In practice, the decision was that if Hamas is able to locate more people under those categories, children, women, and elderly, for each 10 more hostages or kidnapped being returned, there would be 1 more day of ceasefire. So obviously it changed the dynamics of the war. The reason why there was opposition, or some opposition, even though it was near consensus in Israel, but there was some mild opposition, was concern about the changing of the dynamics of the war. Ultimately, Israelis understood that there is no much chance but to take it. It's a little better than the deal that was negotiated about a week ago. It's 4 days, not 5 days. The hours are a little different. There are small changes that Israelis feel are better. But there is no doubt that it opened the door for abrupt changing of the very dynamics of the war. The concern is not so much that Hamas would be able to rearm itself. Yes, regroup itself, reorganize itself, yes. The concern is that the Hamas would be able to bring foreign media, journalists, to take a view of what happened in the northern part of Gaza. And the truth is that the northern part of Gaza has been devastated. devastated to the extent that it's difficult to imagine. You can compare it to Dresden in 1945 at the end of World War II. So the concern is that the space of legitimization that Israel has, and part of it was even making this deal happenings and allowing some kind of humanitarian aid to enter the Gaza strips, that could change that kind of political dynamics in a way that would make it much more difficult for Israel to resume the war politically. Not so much militarily, even though there are some complications militarily, but politically.
Dr.
So there are...
Yes, I just want to come in there. You mentioned that, there is a concern that Hamas may not be able to rearm itself, but they will be able to reorganize and regroup itself. That is one concern. I want you to just elaborate on that. And also the concern that you mentioned that Israel may have, that Hamas may be able to pull in more international journalists to show exactly what has happened in the northern part of Gaza at least. Now, is that a major concern due to which Israel has not been wanting a ceasefire? Is that one of the concerns? And do talk to us about Hamas reorganizing itself as well.
I think it's one of the concerns. There are many, many concerns. The overall concern is changing the very dynamics of the war. Israel has stated many times that it's committed to two things in addition to getting back the hostages. One thing is to destroy the military capabilities of Hamas. The other thing is to eradicate the civic foundations of the Hamas governance in the entire Gaza Strip. So Israel is committed to go to the southern part of Gaza and ultimately indeed to try its best to bring the end to the Hamas regime. Change the dynamics of the things, allowing a different pace. That's opened the door for a lot of new possibilities that the Israelis are concerned about.
Dr. Gowan, one more.
I do not think.
Yes, I just wanted to come in here as well. Now, experts are saying that a ceasefire would send a dangerous message to Israel's additional adversaries, and there are many. There are a lot of non-state actors which have also become part of the onslaught towards Israel from different fronts. Let's take Hezbollah for example. What kind of message does it send to Hezbollah when Israel is willing to give this kind of a pause for a humanitarian truce?
Well, the pause is not for humanitarian truce. It's for getting back the Israeli kidnapped. I mean, there is enormous pressure.
Yeah, but that's how Hamas sees it, as a humanitarian truce. So I'm just saying, Hezbollah being closely linked to Hamas, how do they see it? Yes.
Okay, the situation with Hezbollah is, fortunately for Israel, there are no Israelis being kidnapped by Hezbollah. So it's in a way, it's inapplicable, that kind of situation, to the Hezbollah situation. I don't think it gives any real message to Hezbollah. I think everybody knows that Israel, as being what it is, country with humanitarian values, with strong sense of respect to human lives, is vulnerable when it has about 235 of its people in Gaza, unknown what's happened to them. So the pressure to relieve as many of them was very, very compelling. And that's the reason why the Israeli government somewhat reluctantly had to comply with that pressure.
Dr. Avner Cohen, thank you so much for joining us on Newspoint at this hour. Always a pleasure to speak with you. Would like to have you back on WION World is One for insights on further matters in the war.
Our top story today, Israel's government and Hamas militant group have separately announced that they've agreed to a Qatar-mediated deal. Under the deal, Hamas will free dozens of Israeli hostages in exchange for a 4-day pause in the fighting in Gaza, as well as the release of dozens of Palestinians held in Israeli prisons. Once implemented, the deal will be the biggest diplomatic breakthrough and the first major pause in the fighting since the war began. Let's take a look at how this deal is expected to be implemented. The proposed deal, it's been divided into 2 phases. Hamas is expected to free at least 50 Israeli women and children held in Gaza under the first phase of the deal. Meanwhile, Israel is expected to release about 150 Palestinian prisoners, mostly women and children, over the 4-day pause. Israel will allow around 308 trucks per day to enter Gaza from Egypt. More fuel will also reportedly be allowed in during the pause in fighting. Hamas could release dozens more women, children and elderly people under the second phase. This as the Israeli government said that it would extend the pause for every additional 10 hostages released. Now, in the next 24 hours, Israel is expected to make public the names of the Palestinian prisoners set to be released. This will be done so that Israeli citizens can appeal to court against their release. However, according to officials, Israel, it will not release Palestinian prisoners who've been convicted of killing Israelis. More than 240 people, including several Americans, were abducted during the 7th of October Hamas attacks. 4 hostages, including 2 Americans, have since been released. 1 has been rescued, 2 others were found dead. For more on this, we're now being joined by Dr. Malcolm Davis, who is joining us from Canberra. He's a senior analyst in defense strategy and capability from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Sir, thank you so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure.
And now, Dr. Davis, both Israel and Hamas have agreed to the Qatar-mediated deal. How do you see the release of hostages in exchange for Palestinians progress going forward?
Well, look, I think probably there'll be a great deal of interest on the part of the Israelis to get those hostages back. So I think the deal will go ahead. It will go ahead rather hesitantly because obviously there's a lack of trust, quite understandably, on either side. And then you have the other aspect of this deal besides the hostage release, which is the 4-day ceasefire, as well as the influx of aid and fuel into Gaza. So it's a fairly complex, delicate balance, and a lot of things have to be coordinated moment to moment, but I think this deal will go ahead. The challenge, of course, is that once it's been and done, what happens then? Is additional pressure then put on the Israelis to have another 4-day ceasefire? I think that's quite likely, and it could then turn into a situation where suddenly Israel is confronted with pressure to end the war before it's even achieved its objectives.
In fact, I was going to come to that. But before that, I also want to ask you, Netanyahu has made it clear that the war on ground will still continue. So how do you see this multi-day pause and hostage release shape the course of the war on ground?
Well, during this 4-day period, yes, there will not be any combat operations in terms of the Israelis launching attacks. And we would hope that Hamas would honor that agreement as well. But I think what will happen is the Israeli Defense Forces will use this 4-day ceasefire to essentially gather intelligence on Hamas forces, their locations, watch their communications, because Hamas will certainly use this 4-day pause to resupply their forces. And so I think that assuming that the 4-day ceasefire ends and then the Israeli Defense Force goes back into the fight, it may be that Hamas is more vulnerable at that point. But as I said, Hamas may use this in terms of a political warfare aspect to try and impose a longer delay on that outcome.
Right now, sir, coming back to the point that you had made earlier, this is just the first phase. Do you think pause in the war will be a sigh of relief for the people in Gaza? And do you think there's hope for an all-out humanitarian truce going forward?
I think, there will be, now that this is going ahead, I think there will be additional pressure put on Israel to have another one of these arrangements, to release more hostages, to have a longer ceasefire. Ultimately, the challenge for Israel is that if it refuses that pressure, if it rejects suggestions of additional ceasefires, then hostages remain in Hamas' hands, a greater risk, and Israel continues to lose international support. But if it accepts that pressure, then the risk is that ultimately it turns into a general ceasefire with the Hamas leadership and fighting forces still largely intact. And at that point, Israel then would have to question whether it can achieve its goals in this war.
All right. Dr. Davis, thank you so much for joining us with your insights on this.
Thank you.
We're now joined by Bishop Garrison, a fellow at the National Security Institution at George Mason Law School and adjunct professor at Georgetown University. Sir, thank you so much for joining us on World DNA.